It is a colossal strategic and foreign policy blunder that will cost many, many lives. It is also a humanitarian catastrophe. And of course, I'm talking about Afghanistan, where Canadians fought and died and brought hope. And we did so with Afghans at our side as translators or cooks or cleaners, and of course, eventually as fellow soldiers. So we owe them. To witness President Biden's withdrawal, an unconditional withdrawal, without first evacuating Americans and their allies and Canadians and others, it is stunning and almost inexplicable. So we're going to someone who we hope will help us understand this situation. Major-General retired Denis Thompson served for 39 years, including as NATO's commander of Task Force Kandahar, and subsequently commander of Canadian Special Operations Forces Command. So welcome and thank you so much for being with us today. Truly appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Senator Wallen.
It's great. So to anyone watching, we have known for months, certainly weeks, that the Taliban was on the move. If you were even watching television or reading Twitter, you would find out that they were coming. How did we get to this situation where troops withdraw and people are left, civilians and Afghans alike?
Well, I think first of all, it's worth noting that nobody predicted as swift a collapse of the Taliban, of the government of Afghanistan, the legitimate government of Afghanistan's government to the Taliban in this particular circumstance. And it's largely, at least in my experience and in most Canadian soldiers' experience, we all knew that an Afghan soldier is pretty tough, and they stayed in a fight, but they have to be backed up. They have to have proper logistics, food, water, medical care, and as well they have to
air support.
Air support, enablers such as unmanned air, and all of that. When it was taken from them, their institutions weren't strong enough to provide it, and so that was a major contributing factor to the collapse of the Afghan National Security Forces and this rapid advance of the Taliban, who I think themselves were surprised that they were able to take Kabul with virtually no fighting.
I think that's a really important point, that even they must be surprised, as were the terrorists on 9/11 when the buildings actually fell. To see the international community responding, I don't know whether you've been listening. I'm sure you have, to Boris Johnson, to others around the world. There was a former UK commander, Colonel Camp, in Afghanistan, saying that the scale of this disaster puts the Saigon loss, it minimizes it, that it is just, this is beyond anybody's comprehension.
Yeah, I believe it's on the same scale. The commitment that the United States made to Afghanistan, and a commitment that, by the way, dragged in a whole host of folks, including virtually all NATO nations and a number of coalition partners. Totally shocking to all of us that it occurred in this fashion, and it does resonate on the same scale as the disaster the United States experienced in Vietnam, with that telltale picture of people struggling to get on a Huey helicopter on top of the United States Embassy. There's a lot of similarities, and it's rather unfortunate. It's also worth noting this isn't the first time that a major power has withdrawn from Afghanistan. If you recall, in 1989, the Soviets withdrew after a 10-year occupation of Afghanistan. But what's different here is they withdrew, and I don't like giving the Russians or the Soviets any credit, but they withdrew in an orderly fashion.
Right.
The regime stayed in place for 2 more years, and largely because the Soviets provided budgetary support to the Afghan army and ran the airport, had a bunch of technical advisors on the ground. And this really was the course of action that we were hoping to emulate. I mean, of course, they wouldn't say it that way, but it was a very similar kind of circumstance. So we failed miserably, and the Russians, the regime that was put in place by the Soviets collapsed 2 years later because they had to pull away that budgetary support due to the collapse of the wall, et cetera.
just to bring us up to date, I know you and many others, and I've been getting phone calls from people that I met and connected with during my time in Afghanistan. Where are we? The government has said that there are 2,700 people that have come out. Are they Canadians? Are they other foreign nationals that we've put on the plane? Are there any of our Afghan translators, the guys and the men and women and their families that we should have gotten out? Do we even know who they are?
Somebody does. I can't tell you the answer to that. The government has to tell you that, but I can tell you what I know about the people that we are looking after. So we have approximately 400 Afghan families, and these are the head of the family typically is the Afghan person who supported Canada's mission while it was on the ground between 2001 and 2014, and beyond, because of course it includes the embassy staffers, etc. But you know, in all fairness, most of them got out because they were the low-hanging fruit, if you will. And what we did was, of those 400 families, mostly interpreters, but not exclusively, we helped them find safe houses in Kabul and kept them advised. And by we, I mean the Canadian charity is a Veterans Transition Network, but there's an affiliated NGO on the ground in Afghanistan that is essentially paid for, and these safe houses, et cetera, airplane tickets, all of it being paid for through this NGO. We looked after 400 of these families, and we still are. I mean, we're still connected to them. Of that group who have applied, and there's another group called the Afghan Canadian Interpreters Initiative, who started tracking these people, run by a great lady named Wendy Long. And she started tracking these folks as far back as 2017, helping them to do the paperwork that's required by IRCC to come to Canada. And with
that's our immigration department.
The Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. Huge frustration expressed on her behalf. And when it was obvious, not obvious, when it was announced by the U.S. that they were going to leave, first Mr. Trump and then Mr. Biden, of course, they started to get very nervous because they had at that point, 115 interpreters and their families. So let's say, for the sake of argument, 115 families. The number ballooned up when we added other people like cooks and drivers, et cetera. They, in their frustration because they couldn't get anything to happen inside of the department of the IRCC, turned to myself and Generals Dave Fraser and General Dean Milner. All three of us task force commanders in Kandahar province, all three of us the beneficiaries of the great services provided by these interpreters. We penned an open letter to the three ministers on the 8th of July of this year. So a while ago, but still, they were so desperate because it's a network of they're almost like young veterans, right? There's guys that work for us, guys and girls that work for us. Anyway, so that letter went in, and it prompted a response. So I think 2 Fridays later, and don't quote me on the date, but I think it's the 24th of July, the three ministers announced this new program to get people out.
And you had to fill out forms, and you had
and then that's when you hear the whole dance about an 11-page PDF and all sorts of ridiculous instructions. It's as if somebody was I sent you the paperwork and you lived in Renfrew, Ontario, and you filled it out and only had to drive to the Ottawa International Airport. Well, I'm sorry, that's not Afghanistan. There's complete ignorance of what these people were up against. And so they're stashed away in several of these safe houses. They get contradictory messages, but when the Taliban take over the city, then we were in a position to put one of our Canadians, a Canadian private contractor who's been in Kabul for 11 years, at the entry point with the British battalion that was there, the second battalion parachute regiment. And he helped for the longest time before the Canadians arrived to get these people vetted, sorted, and onto the airfield. But as a result, and I'm just going to turn here and grab my numbers, these are all the fresh numbers today. So of those 400 families, as I mentioned, it ballooned up over time. And that represents well over 2,000 people, probably in the vicinity of 2,600 people. And the numbers are approximate because they change. And the only way we can verify them is through the direct telephone contact we have with these folks. We managed just today Of those 400 files, it will say 180 of them have been recognized by the IRCC. So we still missing 55% of our people. The paperwork's in, but they haven't received an answer yet. And out of that crowd, we think as of yesterday, which is because it's closed. Like the airport is now closed. The operation, the air bridge is over. We got about 70 families out, or 17% of the population that we are looking after. Now what we're forced to do is help them navigate their way to a land border, maybe pay off the Taliban, etc. I mean, there's a whole number of ways this operation could have been conducted, and I think we chose the most bureaucratic and straight-jacketed one I can think of.
Right down to and including we couldn't let some people on planes because there weren't seat belts for them. I really think that this is an extraordinary situation. What accounts for this? Is this particular generation of political leaders not attuned to this? Is it just that it was 20 years ago and people have forgotten? It's hard Canadians see themselves as people who respond in times of need. We have reached out to other foreign groups, embraced them in our community, and it seems like we're being stopped from even doing what is our natural instinct.
I don't know that it's on Canadians, and so there's two aspects to that question. One is the political side, and I know you know all this stuff, Senator. So there's the PMO and all the chiefs of staff and the political staffers, and then there's the professional public service, including the Canadian Armed Forces. So I don't think this is a political issue. If I was a minister and I turned to my deputy minister or my chief of defense staff and said, "Do this, like go invade Botswana," that's all I should have to say. Seriously, I shouldn't have to get into the weeds and give them detailed. And I set some policies. I want you to withdraw. Like in this case, I want you to prioritize Canadian citizens first, and then we'll get these other guys out, these Afghans who supported Canada, and then we'll go down to the third category, which they added late in the game. Women that are under threat, like the journalists, etc. So they open the aperture, which is another reason why the number of our families. It will be
every woman, by the way, under the Taliban.
Oh yeah, I know. Anyway. and so all of that to say, this is as much on the professionals, bureaucrats, as it is on the ministers. Now, that doesn't absolve them of their responsibility, but there was no time between the time we signed that letter, the 8th of July, where we expressly said, we would like you to appoint a senior government official, properly resourced and empowered to make this happen. I spent 5.5 years in the policy group in Ottawa in D&D. I know how these things work. They're called interdepartmental task forces. I've been involved in several of them for various different crises. And it works. I mean, it's still a bureaucracy, but it works. And I am convinced they never stood one up until just a couple of days ago when we couldn't find out who was running the operation. They wouldn't tell us.
Well, this is the problem.
They would not tell us who was in charge.
Campaign, you're not paying attention over here, right? That's and we should be able to do two things at once. But
again, I don't put it on the politicians. If it's that broken, the clerk of the Privy Council reaches down and says, "You there, DM of IRCC, appoint a lead," or "You, DM of Global Affairs Canada, appoint a lead," and then form a. I mean, it's almost a standard operating procedure. I am completely baffled why it didn't happen. And then the second side of this is there, and you would have noticed this over the course of your career. Is there's a tendency now to over-centralize everything in government.
Yeah.
It's not a liberal thing and it's not a conservative thing. It started under Mr. Harper and it didn't change when Mr. Trudeau came in. So it's not political. We have decided that we want to centralize everything at the highest level and we become what I call a one-trick pony. So we can only do one thing at a time. We can't walk and chew bubblegum. And so we get ourselves into these crises and we can't manage them, when clearly the machine is set up to be able to operate through several crises simultaneously. But that didn't happen here. And as a result, 83% of our families are still in Afghanistan, and we're going to have to figure out how to get them out.
So Joe Biden's spokespeople and the president himself and our politicians here are being asked the obvious question. We are going to leave people behind. It's that simple. There's no other way to get them out.
Including American citizens, and in our case, Canadian citizens. I don't know what the number is. You'd have to ask. I know it was asked in the press conference, but they didn't want to put their finger on it. But there's a thing called the ROCA. So I'm sure you know the abbreviation stands for registered. Now I've forgotten. Canadians abroad.
Yeah, Canadians abroad.
Right.
Yeah.
It's anyway. It's held by an embassy, and you are technically supposed to check in when you arrive in a country, so your name's on the ROCA. Well, clearly, if you're going to Florida or Oktoberfest in Munich, you don't bother. But if you go to Afghanistan, the ROCA is usually pretty accurate. Or if you're in Mali or someplace like that, so that people know you're there. You're a Canadian citizen. Your residence is in Kandahar, and you're a contractor for, I don't know, the sewage company. So that when one of these crises occur, you can be contacted and told what to do. So they have to have an idea of how many people they've brought back from the ROCA, and therefore how many people are still still haven't made it out of the country. Now, I'm less worried about them because I don't see the Taliban going after somebody with a passport carrying Canadian when commercial flights resume. And I'm making a big assumption here.
Yeah,
if they ever do resume, they go to the airport, they get on a plane, they fly home. But those families that we're dealing with, that would be approximately 330 families. That's not an option for them, even if they do have a Canadian visa. So
the Taliban has said quite clearly there will be no Afghans leaving the country after the 31st of August, period, full stop.
Right. But, it's a porous border. The unfortunate thing is it's only going to be the fittest that make that journey.
Yeah. The I guess people may need this highlighted for them as well, that even with the August 31st deadline, that means we're really shutting down operations in the next 24, 48 hours, because that's the time when the last American troop is to leave. So everybody that's going, every plane that's going has to be out well in advance of the 31st.
Right, because it's not. I think I heard somebody on the press conference say it's not like flipping a switch. It's there's something that has to happen. So if you back up the timings and figure out how long it's going to take the Americans to get those 5,000 troops out, and you do a rearward time and space analysis, that means that we got you exactly right, 24 to 48 hours on this date, the 25th of August, to wrap things up. My understanding is that there are no more people being admitted to the airfield.
Correct.
And that the Canadians that we have inside and the deserving Afghan families that we've managed to get inside, that's it. The rest of them are going to be left to their own devices.
Too bad.
Well,
so sad.
Without government assistance or tangible government assistance, but there will still be a committed group of Canadians back here that are going to do their damnedest to get them out.
What we're hearing from the analysts from around the world, and those who would know, including people like you in the military, is that the Americans have left behind their equipment, their communications equipment, their helicopters, their planes, their guns, their uniforms. It's the drones, everything that's there. We are now going to be dealing with a very, very different Taliban than the kind of ragtag gang that was there 20 years ago. This is now going to be very sophisticated. It's going to become a homeland, of course, for other terrorist groups. We know they're already there, and others will flock there to work and train. So the notion that people will be able to sneak their way out, or that there might be a resumption of flights, for example, private flights. What's your thinking on that? Do you think that's even possible given what we're now dealing with?
Well, there's lots of nefarious regimes around the world that have regular commercial flights. I don't think that's going to be a super big issue, because there will be people that recognize or at least deal with this government. And I'd like to make a distinction between recognizing a government and talking to or negotiating with the government. They're as you know, they're two different
Yep.
things. So we will, I'm almost certain, not recognize that government because we're not in the habit of recognizing governments that took over with which what amounts to a large scale, a very large scale military coup. We won't do that. But I don't know that we have a choice but to negotiate with them, on a second track or whatever they want to call it, in order to get some of the things accomplished that we need to get accomplished. With respect to the military and the Taliban in general, I think people need to understand that Taliban was never a global threat and have no interest in anything outside of their interest. Yes, they can become the harbor to Al Qaeda. No, they won't become a harbor to ISIS-K because ISIS is there's no love lost between those two organizations. They follow two different regimes, and so we may see an upsurge in basing for organizations like Al Qaeda that do have a global reach. Yep. However, in this case, Mr. Biden has convinced us all, maybe not me, but he's convinced a number of people that he can do counterterrorism from over the horizon, as he says. It's possible. He cites a number of examples, and I can think of several, like Nigeria and Kenya, etc. But in those countries, there's still a footprint, and so there was an opportunity here to leave a footprint on the ground. It would be a permanent presence, but it would have kept Afghanistan ticking along while we worked on their institutions. Much as we have done, for instance, if you look at the Korean conflict, there have been American troops there since the 1950s, with good reason. And what were two equal countries in terms of their economic development are now entirely different, largely because of the security generated by the presence of American and other armies. So I'm not worried about them invading Pakistan or taking on one of their neighbors because they're not interested. They're just interested in their own backyard.
Well, Pakistan's their safe place, so they won't be doing that. I'm asking part of this because I hear Mr. Trudeau softening the ground in terms of we will have to have relations. And as you say, there's an important distinction between recognizing a government and dealing with reality, which is that they are in control on the ground, but also somehow suggesting that we would be able to continue with the nation building and the funding of democratic efforts or women's organizations. We weren't even realistic about that the first time around. It's hard to imagine how any of that is possible in this circumstance.
I mean, I would agree. I don't know that it's going to be feasible. The Taliban leadership is making the right noises, but it's also important to point out that the Taliban's not a homogenous organization, the same kind of pyramid style organization as a military. And so you don't know what happens at the coalface where those young Taliban fighters exist. And I think we need to bear that in mind, because if we do believe that we're going to put some development programs on the ground, that's going to require some negotiation with the Taliban, and some of that will probably be money that's siphoned off and used for them to prop up their government. They're going to have a heck of a time governing without the development support that Afghanistan, the legitimate nation, enjoyed, which, as I understand it, and I'm not an economist, was 80 to 90% of their GDP was generated, their government funds were generated from outside the country. So that, good luck managing this place and avoiding famine and a whole host of other things under those conditions.
Well, as I witnessed myself on a couple of trips to Afghanistan, what can't happen again and what won't happen again is our soldiers coming in, our men and women coming in off a 48-hour op or a 72-hour op, and before they even had a shower or a meal, they'd go out and rebuild the school building that they had built and the Taliban had then in turn burned down, so that young girls could go to school. We went into those schools. We watched the young girls learning how to read and write. That's part of what we were doing there, a big part of what we were doing there. If you're not on the ground, you don't do any of that. That doesn't exist.
Yeah, I mean, most nation building and it's easy to explain, and which I'm going to do in 2 seconds here, but it's devilishly difficult to get done. The first thing you have to do is establish a safe and secure environment, which isn't exclusively military, but up at the front end, it's an overwhelming military presence, something we never achieved in Afghanistan. And then you slowly introduce other things like police, et cetera. Once you've got a safe and secure environment in place, then you can put in the rule of law as the next kind of tier, and you start to develop institutions, police forces, customs and border services, prison services, all the stuff that you need to establish and maintain the rule of law. And then after that, you can get to good governance, or as we like to say in Canada, POG, right? Peace, order, and good governance is our buzzword. But it's true. Those things, one depends on the other. So the fact that we never really established a safe and secure environment across Afghanistan, with some notable exceptions in some of the provinces to the north, and it was super difficult in Kandahar, plays into the fact that this entire project, if you will, the 20-year project, was a failure. And it has to be said, it was a failure.
When President Biden said the other day that this is on the Afghan army, that they were cowards, that they were corrupt, that if they won't defend their country, too bad, that's on them. I found that offensive on so many levels, I can't begin to say, because it implies that everybody that was there, that stood up this army, that was there to back them, and as you said at the beginning of our conversation, they needed our help and support. The only reason they succeeded is because we were there doing backup. But to me, that kind of a comment shows a profound misunderstanding of what is going on in that country, what the reality is in that country.
Well, Mr. Biden has his own reasons to make those statements, because he's obviously trying to shift the blame from himself to somebody else, and that happens to be the Afghan security forces. But they do bear the brunt. The institutional level bears the brunt of responsibility in large measure, and the sudden collapse of the Afghan National Army leadership is indicative of some kind of rot at the interior that certainly the U.S. must have been aware of. We're not, because we left in 2014.
Right.
But I just find it a little bit peculiar, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, that Hamid Karzai stayed in Afghanistan, because you think he'd be the first guy who would be swinging from a lamppost somewhere.
Right.
But there's a rot in the interior, and the Taliban, the greatest expression, I'm sure you've heard it. You have the watches, we have the time. They took the long strategy, and they worked their influence through the tribal networks. And I think when this thing is analyzed in detail later on, we'll find out that there were some nefarious actors on the inside that caused this collapse. But I have to admit, I'm sure the Taliban were even fascinated by it.
I agree totally that the leadership of some of the Afghan forces, of course, were corrupt and remain corrupt throughout. But we can't lose sight of the fact that 50,000 Afghan soldiers also lost their lives in the last decade.
Precisely. Yeah. And like I said, the individual soldier, brave to the point of being foolhardy.
Yeah.
Quite remarkable at the individual level. But you're dealing with a country. This isn't like training an army in an industrialized state. You get a level of illiteracy, et cetera. You're battling a whole bunch of obstacles, if you will, basic obstacles that you wouldn't see in a modern army in the West.
I don't want to dwell too much on President Biden, but I was reading material around this, and there was a quote from Richard Holbrooke's book, his diary, about the time when Joe Biden was vice president. And of course, it's well known that he wanted out of Afghanistan and wanted out of Afghanistan for quite some time. But he basically said, and I won't use the language because it was F that and F this, is that he thinks that they'll just get away with it. Nixon and Kissinger got away with it, and he will too. Do you think they will?
I don't know. I couldn't predict the future. I will say this, though. There's a difference between the Army that went to Vietnam and the Army, the US Army, and even the NATO armies that went to Afghanistan. And that is, there were no conscripts. When you send a conscript army into the field, you are sending your sons and daughters to combat. When you send a professional army to the field, and all the malls keep running at the same time, and people still go to the theaters, and the restaurants are all open, it's a distant thought, unless you happen to be connected to one of those people. And that percentage is tiny. It's small in the U.S., which has an enormous military, and it's minuscule here. So yeah, maybe he could make that calculation and get away with it. I don't know. Well, I'm not a political analyst. We'll see what happens. But there is a fundamental difference between the army that went to Vietnam and the American army, which, by the way, at another great institution. I have all the time in the world. I had a battalion of Americans under command in Kandahar, very solid. And I was 3 years in Egypt as commanding a multinational force and observers with another 700 Americans throughout that 3-year period that worked with me, or for me, if you wish, and helped me out, because we had a chapter of Islamic State in the Sinai Peninsula in our backyard, and it was just as tricky as any other mission I've been on. So I have all the time in the world for the U.S. military, but as I said before, policy is set at the highest level. Yep. In this case, Mr. Biden, and that ties the hands of what the U.S. military is able to do.
I think you've made a really important point about the connection. I mean, we have this problem in Canada, which is our bases are hidden away, and we don't even connect the civilian and the military worlds that often. They live in parallel universes, and so this isn't a big issue for many in that sense, unless, as you say, you're connected. You have some connection with that country and with the people in it. So how do you think this is going to play out? Are Canadians just going to say at some point, well, okay, we tried our best, that's it? Or do you think this issue and people like you who are working away at it will have public support to keep doing what you're doing?
When you say doing what you're doing, you mean in terms
still trying to help people escape, leave, find another route out?
Oh, we'll get public support. I mean, we've even put in, and perhaps you could help us with this, Senator Wallen. We put in a $5 million ask for this Veteran Transition Network to help us keep this network alive. We raised $500,000 in a very short period of time in this Veteran Transition Network. In fact, just over a few weeks, in order to continue the operations of their on the ground that they have ongoing in Kabul in terms of safe houses and all the other things that need to be bought for them. And it's a fascinating story. How they move the money in and out of Afghanistan is I have a lot of confidence in this particular organization.
Yeah. And you have to be, I understand this has to be below the radar to a certain extent, or it'll be shut down. And you have to be very careful about even how much information, how many people you're talking about, because the Taliban are now very sophisticated. They're online, they're using Twitter, they're using social networks. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, I would say they're very adept at information operations. They can certainly put the propaganda out, but I don't know that they have a signals intelligence capability like China or Russia.
Well, I really do appreciate your time and insights on this. I wish you all the best in your continued efforts, and that we'll put the pressure on as best we can to make sure that these organizations are funded. I saw what Care Canada did on the ground. You know, when people really have their heart in it, it works.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And thank you for reaching out, because I think we need to keep this on the front burner, even though we're in the middle of an election. Absolutely,
we do. Retired Major General Denis Thompson served for 39 years, and as you can hear and see, he's still serving. Thank you so very much for what you're doing.